invitation to speak at this fabulous venue. I've been hearing that it's not so common that Islamic subjects are discussed, but the location seems so fitting to me in a sense a very profound honor because of the Lodi Gardens that I spent most of this morning sort of wandering through. It's such an incredible place, and so the presence of Islam is very much with us and with me in this building from my perspective as well. So just wanted to mention that. And really delight to have a sort of intimate gathering as compared to the large assembly in Hyderabad. I'm looking forward to a lot of discussion. So I'll be giving an overview of a project that began a few months ago. It's a 5-year project, and I just wanted to say a few sort of general points about that before I begin. One thing is that this is a collaborative project funded by the European Research Council, and so unlike a lot of research projects, especially literary research projects, which are very much about the lone scholar sitting alone in an archive, or going through a text in isolation, this is a project that involves 3 postdocs with different expertise, and it is truly collaborative. $1.5 million to hire various people from around the world to kind of assist. So I'll be giving a very broad overview, as well as going into the specifics of some specific texts that I have worked on individually as a lead up to the project. But I just don't want you to get this idea that this is something I alone, in isolation of my office or bedroom, I'm going to be achieving, because it really is something that it will be involving 3 full-time scholars for a period of 4 years working together with me, and I'm so my job is to create the framework that the theoretical categories that are informing our research, to decide the kind of parameters. And so this is very, very broad, and it really wouldn't be appropriate for a single person to undertake this, but that's kind of the great opportunity I have, is that I don't have to do it in isolation. I'm assembling a team to do it together. So that's one thing to say. And it's just a little bit of background about myself in addition to the generous introduction you've heard that kind of positions me to work on this particular topic. My dissertation was on Habsiyat, prison poetry of Shervani and other poets from the Caucasus, but also with some intersections to South Asia, like Masood Saad Salman. And I was very interested in Persian poetry during the time. The voice is too loud. Is that better? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
And thank you for, feel free to make noises or hand signals or whatever you'd like. What was I saying? I came to it in a sort of, I did my undergraduate work in a totally different area, modern Russian anti-colonial literature from the Caucasus. But my PhD was quite a radical shift, partly because I wanted to know the pre-modern sources of the Islamic text I was working on. But one thing that struck me was that the assessing and engaging with these 12th century prison poems required a lot more than just reading poetry kind of in isolation in the way that, say, you read a novel. It also required a kind of paradigm shift in terms of thinking about what is beauty and what makes for good poetry, what brings joy to the reader's heart. How do you assess eloquence? The standards, the criterions of aesthetic excellence were so radically different. And I found that while there was quite a lot of scholarship on the poetry itself, for example, historical scholarship saying, where did this poem come from? Who was the ruler? Social history. There wasn't so much that could kind of prepare me as a reader to just enjoy it as literature. There wasn't literary theory, in other words. But then that was one step that I noticed. The next thing I realized was that there actually was literary theory, although it isn't called that, from the 12th century, from the period itself. There was a lot of reflection on what makes for good poetry, what makes a text beautiful and successful and meaningful and powerful. That wasn't finding its way so much into the contemporary 21st century criticism, but it existed. And that went by the name of balagha, which can be rendered in various ways. Most traditionally, rhetoric is one rendering. I'm actually now leaning towards maybe translating it as poetics, so both ways are possible. I'll discuss the the ins and outs of that word in more detail, but balagha exists in Arabic, Urdu, Persian. It's just the science of thinking about literary language or aesthetic language as an aesthetic production. And that is the subject of this project, Global Literary Theory. Before proceeding, it might also be useful for me to kind of give a kind of rough, usable definition of what I mean by literary theory, because it's a term that has gotten me into trouble multiple occasions. So just in case, I'm happy to have counter definitions. And my voice is that, I don't want to, how is this? It's okay, even, okay. Yes, so a rough and ready definition of literary theory from my perspective. It's very simple. I don't mean to kind of say that, compare it to Derrida or something like that. Not at all. I'm just saying that literary theory is that which reflects on what makes literature literary. So any kind of text, any document, any insight, theoretical claim that has something to say about, say, the difference between a literary text and just a everyday statement, or an inscription, or whether some things are literary, some things are not, and that has been with us since the beginning. As I mean, all of you know, right? As being from South Asia, you would know. Although there are a lot of people in the United States who I've been told many times that literary theory is a 20th century invention, and I'm kind of pushing it back against that idea. But I have a very general definition of literary theory, right? That's not, it goes well beyond, say, Derrida and Said and so forth. So that's the scope of the project, to look at the transmission of the science of balagha across multiple literatures of the Islamic world. And I'll go into some case studies about those traditions. Just walk you through two, the first in more detail, the transmission of balagha from Arabic into Persian, and then very briefly from Persian into the other vernacular languages of the Islamic world. Then I'll just talk about some of the kind of the mechanisms through which this ambition, the conceptual ambition, will be realized, the structure of the project, and then some more broader conceptual goals and its relevance more generally for comparative literature. And I just added the slide. Since the Clyde conference, actually, the slide is inspired by the Clyde conference. I was given, and I think I brought the book, 1 second. Yes. At the Clyde conference, I was given this fabulous book I recommend to everyone. It was quite an interesting volume, published a few months ago. And I've really been enjoying reading it. I believe it's the proceedings of the previous Clyde conference. And there's quite a lot of stimulating reflection there on alternative models of comparative literature. And one thing that jumped out at me in one of the essays by Nabanita Devsen, called The Story of Comparative Literature in Us, is the following statement. Sadly, I noticed that we are still looking westwards, if less for texts than more for the theories. And that resonates very strongly with the mission behind this project, because, as I say, I don't really take issue with the claim that we live in a global world. We have this Norton anthologies of world literature galore. We have, it's very easy for, say, an American undergraduate to read an excerpt of the Rahman if they wish, or to read some Shahnama, or there's always this kind of tokenism that's part of the legacy of world literature. But I think that achievement of world literature is somehow mistaken for maybe the aims of comparative literature being fulfilled. And what's lost there is that the theories themselves, the normative dominant theories of literature are still overwhelmingly European, even at sort of the highest levels of scholarship in the academy. And so I think if this project is successful, one thing that it can do is remind readers that 12th century theoreticians also had something to say about the nature of beauty that can help us think differently about things like authorship, creativity, translation. And so the theories, it's just as important, if not more important, that the theories come from places other than Europe, as well as the text. And I think we've done relatively well as a discipline, as a profession of literary scholars in moving beyond European text, but theories not so much. That's been much more difficult. So So as I said, this ilm al-balagha, the science of textualized rhetoric, is a more, maybe even more nuanced definition of that term, or text poetics, is concerned with some of the kind of structural research questions guiding it. What is literature? The nature of literary representation. So obviously that's a core question for Aristotelian poetics that was also very influential in the Arabic tradition of people like al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd. One aspect of the tradition I'm looking at, and why does literature matter? Those are some of the core guiding questions. And one thing, though, that makes Islamic literary theory, and happy to have that term contested, by the way, it usually is at some point when the questions and answers, but one thing that makes it, I think, interesting, maybe paradoxical as a category for some, but also I think distinctive and interesting for me as a reader, is the role of Quranic hermeneutics in defining literature. And so I'll be talking about that in substantial detail in the next few minutes. So that's one thing, and that's why I would kind of insist, at least for now, unless I'm persuaded otherwise, on using the term Islamic literary theory to refer to literary criticism from the Islamic world, because the Quranic hermeneutics, rather, the methodology for reading the Quran is at the foundation of what we might want to call secular poetic criticism. The tools are identical. The text, they're in the text, that I'll give you some examples in a second. So from my perspective, it doesn't really make sense to kind of sever, or to take the Islamic out of literary theory from the Islamic world. Even if they don't necessarily make reference to the Quran, they're still using tools that they took from previous theologians in thinking about the Quran. And so that really is a structural distinctiveness that I'll talk about, that why that's interesting from a literary theorist in more detail. And then, of course, another thing that's very striking about Islamic literary theory is just the coherence. Given the diversity of languages we're talking about. The case studies in my project are Arabic, Persian, and Turkic literatures. And maybe there's room for some Urdu as well, if there's interest from scholars, it's possible. But then there are also Malay, Bangla, other literatures as well. And it's really actually kind of astonishing to see how certain terms, like the words for metaphor, istiara, tashbih, simile, carry across these cultures. The translatability of certain terms are really give it a coherence. And same thing can be said for genres, the genres of the Islamic world as well, the ghazal, right? Even in literatures like Arabic and Persian that are not related to each other, somehow they managed to find a genre that translated across different literatures. So as I said, the importance of Quranic hermeneutics is really crucial for thinking about poetry and the Quran. Does anyone here know, aside from established experts, any non-established expert know what ijaz is? Or aside from people who've heard the lecture already? It's not a familiar term, right? So is it worth dwelling on a little bit? This is a really core concept that I think in some sense marks out Islamic literary theory as distinctive. So it's the teaching of the inimitability of the Quran, or literally it means miracle. So it's the word for miracle. And the teaching that the Quran is a miracle, in the sense that it's proof of the divinity of God, of the supremacy of God. And its very existence is a miracle. And one implication of that, because we're talking about a text, is that it's a miracle in the sense of its beauty, right? So its beauty, its eloquence, its verbal superiority is by definition the standard for every other form of discourse, with the caveat that it's a standard that can never be achieved, right? So it's perfect. It's that which every poet would want to emulate, but never can emulate, because poets are just mere humans. So there's an intrinsic tension between this kind of transcendence of the Quran and its absolute perfection, and that perfection is first and foremost aesthetic. It's when in the text, I'll be giving you two examples in a second, but I think it's important to underscore, and maybe this is a little bit controversial, but the kind of the methodology through which the perfection is demonstrated is aesthetic. It's not necessarily done in moral terms, right? It's not stated that the teaching of the Quran, at least in the text that I'll be giving you examples of, the argument is not so much that we know the Quran is a miracle because it teaches us this truth and this truth and this truth. It's we know the Quran is a miracle because it is beautiful in this way and this way and this way. And so the writers who made these claims were also the writers who defined the science of poetry criticism. So that's an implication of that tradition is that poetry suddenly has a huge investment in the key religious questions of the age. Poetry becomes a political art as well. It becomes the kind of thing for which people can be killed if they have the wrong doctrine and so forth. It becomes enmeshed in politics, and it becomes somehow in competition in some ways with the Quran, but also always referencing it. So let me actually, before I think this would be a good moment, I added these slides also recently from my last talk, just to kind of flesh out a little bit of what I'm saying, because these are very general claims. And of course, if one could go to a different, Islamic thought is such a rich tradition that I'm sure you could find one tradition that would maybe contradict some of what I said. But I'm basing my claims and the argument, the tradition I'm talking about, in Arabic at least, is based on these two authors, Rumani. So these slides will not have been seen by Chandra yet. Al-Rumani, who was writing in the 10th century in Baghdad, and al-Baqillani. So these were both theologians and literary critics. I would say that they consider themselves to be first and foremost theologians. In fact, this is a time when there wasn't necessarily an isolated discipline of the critic, or those not at least not for poetry. So if you wanted to sort of make your way in court and get a reputation for yourself, you did that by engaging with the Islamic sciences, and that's what these scholars did. But reading their text now, I think any of us would necessarily come to the conclusion that they are literary theorists. At least they're very interested in what makes literature literary, and the way they read the Quran is how a literary critic would read a text. So I'll just give you two examples to kind of flesh this out. And again, it's worth remembering that both of these books, and here's, if you want to learn more, here's a text I recommend to you, 3 treatises on the ijaz of the Quran, or the miracle of the Quran. It's a very good translation with a scholarly introduction. So the primary goal of these texts is to prepare the reader to appreciate the Quran. But along the way, they also develop a science of literary criticism. So they walk through, Rumani walks us through some of the ways in which the Quran is inimitable. I won't go into too much detail because this is a lot of material to cover, so I'm not going to dwell too much on all of this, but some of the points, the ones to really point out, is the Quran's intrinsic eloquence. He's referencing certain verses in the Quran also that demonstrate its challenge to the reader and so forth, the truth of information pertaining to future events, so its ability to tell prophecy, its alignment with other miracles. But the intrinsic eloquence part is key to what I'm saying. And then Baqillani, another influential theologian, coming from the same milieu, a little bit after Rumani, he opens his major work of Quranic hermeneutics by asking, can the ijaz, the miracle of the Quran, be recognized by the rhetorical figures which it contains in? The answer is, and then he doesn't quite give an answer, but he walks us through all the experts who have answered the question before him. So the people, the experts, and those who have composed books on the subject of the character of the figurative language have recorded opinions which we are going to recount. And then he walks us through specific verses in the Quran that are for him felicitous uses of imagery. So lower to them the wing of humility out of compassion. This kind of use of figurative language is the technique, or kind of extracting these forms of rhetoric. That's his methodology for proving the miracle of the Quran. The other example, the mother of the book, that's in and of itself that's a way in which the Quran is often referred to, but it's a figure of speech. And so these critics, theologians / literary theorists are very interested in that figurative aspect. And I would say that they made the use of figurative language valid for poets, for the poets who came after and who certainly read these texts. So that's just a very brief overview of the very basic foundations of the science of rhetoric in the Arabic tradition that was inherited by Persian scholars, whom I work more on the Persian side. And just a very broad and brief geography of the circulation of some of these texts. I've walked through this transmission already. And yeah, just to move again quickly, I want to leave time for questions, but to the one broad case study of the transmission of the literary theory I've been speaking about that emerges from Quranic hermeneutics to a Persian context. And of course, what's important about a Persian context, and here I mean initially Central Asia, but South Asia a few centuries later, is that Persian is not the language of the Quran, right? So the nature of that, even though the tradition of Quranic hermeneutics remains in the background, it's by now quite distant, simply because the linguistic medium of poetry changes. So this text is a really fascinating one that I've written an article about. In fact, it's probably the text that turned me onto this whole idea of this project, Tarjuman al-Balagha, so that could be rendered as the translator of rhetoric or the translation of rhetoric or poetics. It's a work that it takes the categories of the Arabic tradition, so all the terminology, I mean the very precise, and those of you who are Sanskritist would know a lot of parallels in the Sanskritic tradition, the different figures of speech, different types of metaphor, simile, and so forth. So it carries all of that over into Persian, but it does something kind of strange, maybe from a linguistic perspective, that it does everything it can to kind of wipe away the traces of Arabic influence, even while taking appropriating the categories. So just one example, that the word Allah is not used. Instead, we have Huda, the term for the Persian term for God. It also means Allah, but it loses the Arabic link. All the poetic citations are in Persian, and this was a time, the 11th century, this is the time of the Shahnameh, a time of a lot of Persian poetry being born. So it's not so unusual to be composing in Persian, but to be composing a scientific text in Persian is a new thing, a kind of bold thing to do in this context. And so I would say that his wiping away some of the Arabic is a way of kind of announcing the newness of his agenda, the newness of what he's doing. And it was a text that influenced a lot of poets, but the author kind of faded into obscurity. So there's three core texts of the Persian that brought about the Persian translation of Arabic rhetoric, and so that's the first text. The second text, Vatsayan's Magic Gardens and the Nuances of Poetry. This is a text that was very influential at the Mughal court, by the way. It's cited as being in the libraries of Akbar and all the poets, Fayez and others. And it was, in terms of linguistically, it brings back some of the Arabic. It has citations from both Persian and Arabic. It's interesting that seems to have been more influential, maybe because it's more of a kind of manual for giving instruction to the poet how to compose verse, so it has a very practical orientation. Conceptually, at least from my perspective, it doesn't quite go as far as the Raduyani text. And then the third text, and I'm happy to dwell on any of these in more detail, but I don't want to miss time for questions. This one's a very voluminous, authoritative, really it's kind of the go-to text of Persian rhetorical criticism, the Mujam, Shamsi Qays. It was written, here again you have the kind of uncomfortable relationship to the Arabic tradition in the sense that the poet apologizes at the beginning for composing his text in Persian. He says his excuse is that he first wrote it in Arabic and then he was asked to write it in Persian, so he did for the benefit of other readers. But there was always a sense of the Arabic tradition still has this kind of authoritative weight that all of these critics have to reckon with, in a sense. And so I guess more to make the sort of general point, the reason why I'm dwelling on these details is that they are doing something relatively new. I'm arguing, at least, they're doing something in the Islamic tradition that has not been done in the Arabic tradition. But this innovation, that I'll give you examples in a second, the innovations that they're doing are kind of hidden under a apologetic framework because of the supremacy of the Arabic tradition, including the fact that the Quran is the language of sacred discourse. So it's not announced as boldly as their project isn't announced as boldly as it might be, and maybe that could be one reason why scholars to date have not really picked up on what seems to me very original insights into the nature of literature. So just give you one example. From this authoritative Mujam by Shamsi Qays. So one of his major concerns, and the concerns in general of the rhetorical tradition, is what can be called sadiqat. One way to translate that is appropriation or imitation, or literally it comes from the word for theft, for stealing, plagiarism. It means all of those things. And Shamsi Qays, in terms of advising the poet, how should the poet relate to his predecessors? How to deal with the authority of tradition? He offers 4 different models for engaging with the past, with the past tradition. So the one model that he considers to be off limits and that should be avoided at all costs is called intihal, passing off another person's poetry as one's own. So just blatant, not changing it, in other words. Just we would call that plagiarism today, right? So just uncreatively stealing a text and saying that it's yours, and not. I think it's the not changing part that's the real problem. And then the second worst, in other words, not the worst, but close to the worst, poems that reuse old meanings and wordings in new verses. And the meanings and wordings, that's the ma'ana, and for those familiar with this tradition, wordings, lafs. So poems that don't change the relationship between the words have a specific meaning, right? And then they have the form that they take. This is a recurrent feature of Arabic, Persian, and so forth literary criticism. Even if there's some changes to the poem, but that relationship of word and meaning doesn't change, it's still not creative enough from his perspective. Now, going to the good kinds of appropriation, it's the third kind, ilmam, is when you use another poet's mental content. In other words, mana, or the meaning, the intended signification behind every word. So when you read a poem, you can see like the poet has one thing in mind, but then it's expressed in another way. So if that intended meaning is used, but in a different expression, that to Shamsi Qays is a kind of, we're moving towards actual creativity. So this is it's a theory of appropriation. It's also a theory of creativity. As well as translation, which I'll get to in a second. The best kind, the kind that is acceptable and which he advises the poet to engage in, is naql. It's also a word that does mean translation in its original context. It surpasses the verse the poet was imitating. So it's permissible to use poetry from the past if you surpass that which you're imitating. So it's really a kind of injunction to the poet to be creative. You can be imitative if you're also creative, and if you also surpass your predecessor. So that's just one example of something. And here's a case where all of the terms here, all of this terminology is Arabic, but you're not going to find this theorization in the Arabic tradition itself. So it's a productive engagement with Arabic, but also a kind of surpassing of Arabic. I won't dwell too much on these. So I just summarized that sort of case study. And while I see something very new taking place within the Persian tradition that isn't really announced as such, but I think poets understood it. And they took literally the advice of their critics. And some of these critics were poets. They were very close to other poets. They certainly had an impact on the culture of their time. And by the way, and this isn't something that I'm personally not an expert in, but it certainly should be part of this project, they also influenced Urdu. These theorizations were heavily influential in the development of early Urdu poetry. And very briefly, I'll maybe run through just this one example, the third case study, which again is not being undertaken by myself, but it seems so central to thinking about the changing meaning of language and of literature, the place of literature in literary culture that happens around the 16th century with early modern conceptions of language. So most notably in the context of Central Asia, Chagatai poetics, in which case there's this poet Navai who wrote what he called the Judgment of Two Languages. So it's a text that similarly to Raduyani, who I discussed at the beginning, does something very new in a new language, in this case Chagatai, but it does so with a deep debt to the past. So he has this, he criticizes, this is a poet, by the way, who is very close friends with Jami, the Persian poet. He wrote in Persian, but his main legacy is to criticize everyone who would dare to use Persian because it's not, it doesn't reflect the language of his own people, the Turkic people. So he says, Turkey poets and writers should have used their own tongue and not resorted to others. If they were capable of composing in both tongues, they should have composed most in their own tongue and only rarely in another. Turkey says Turkey is superior to Persian as regards to the formation of words and expressions. One thing that's worth noting here is just that the actual language in which he makes these claims is overwhelmingly, it's a Turkic language overwhelmingly in a Persian lexicon. So it's, I guess the theory is moving ahead of the practice. There's a sense of something, a kind of nascent regional identity is being born, but the practice is still reliant on the previous tradition. And similar parallels can, of course, be seen in early Urdu. I'm just not going to dwell too much on these slides because there's obviously a lot you can ask me about. I'll just briefly talk about the structure of the project, right? The actual mechanics of how, with maybe 10 different languages, 5 centuries, how do I propose to extract anything coherent from this, right? As I said, this is not me. I will be involved in a lot of the Persian side of it, but I am or have already hired 3 postdocs to direct these strands. So there's an Arabist who is also a specialist in pre-Islamic Egyptian poetry as well, who's leading the Arabic strand, and I'll be hiring someone to do something similar in Persian and Turkic literatures, and we will be co-authoring texts together that compare these treatises that I've given you some of the names. So that's the job, is just to translate some of the core parts of these texts to enable comparison, because there isn't much crossover. These texts are studied in isolation within national traditions, and that's not how it should be. The poets in question did read each other, so we'll be translating these texts, making them available, producing an anthology over the course of four years, 4 workshops, selecting what are the most important texts, and also giving them a framework that hopefully will be of interest, not just to specialists of the Islamic world, but to anyone who's interested in thinking differently about some of the core questions of aesthetics, like what makes literature literary, what is an author, what is imitation, what is the relationship between sacred and secular discourse. So those are some of the questions guiding our work. And I think that's the last slide. And I have some details about how to stay in touch. We have the first spot. We already had one workshop in Beirut last year in May, and a volume is going to be forthcoming from Oxford University Press, hopefully 2020, called Post-Eurocentric Poetics, New Approaches from Arabic, Persian, and Turkic Literary Theory. Thank you very much. We'll close it.
Thank you, Rebecca. What she has given is no doubt a survey of the vast corpus of literature in terms of space, short flow of the literature, and which comes like a river, and from Iraq and other things which I could understand. But we have two experts here who will be now giving their perceptive comments in the context of what Rebecca has said. First, I request Professor Harish Trivedi to kindly speak.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra Mohan. It's a pleasure for all of us to be here, and a privilege, in fact, to listen to this lecture by Professor Rebecca Gould. She is, we were talking about some of these things earlier over tea, and what I was struck by most of all was the sheer daring and the ambition of the project that she's taken on. And whatever is accomplished at the end of it, I'm sure it'll be substantially accomplished, if not fully, will be illuminating in a new kind of way. So congratulations to you on having taken it on. You know, the word global occurs in the title of your project. And we can see that what you presented today is only the tip of the iceberg and a general kind of plan. I myself have been associated with not a global but a world project for the last so many years. In the year 2004, a collegium was established of international scholars in Stockholm, which took it upon itself to write a history of world literature in 4 volumes. The 2 persons invited to that conference were from India, were Kapila and myself. Wow. And as ill luck would have it, due to a glitch on the part of Kapila ji's travel agent, the then travel agent, I hope you've sacked him up. Due to that glitch, Kapila ji could not travel to that conference. And therefore, by default, I became a representative for this part of the world. And since 2004, and it's 15 years now, 2019, I think we're now beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I'm sure that within your time frame, much shorter time frame, you'll accomplish everything, partly because your funding has a timeline.
Good point.
There's that. We had no one source of funding. We had many things coming here and there. The other thing that strikes me about this formulation, which I think will arouse interest, curiosity, and maybe some kind of interrogative exploration on the part of a number of people to whom you present your work, is the use of the phrase Islamic literary theory. I'm sure you've thought and deliberated long about it, and then arrived at this formulation. And you've also explained where it comes from in your interpretation about the very intimate link between Quran and poetry. And that may be quite so. And there may be a miraculous quality at the same time to the Quran, as you have explained. And at the same time, if we grant that miraculous quality immediately on the terms of the Quran, we are in danger perhaps of excluding people who are not within the fold. One man's miracle may be another man's fantasy. So there is this very interesting formulation of the heart. On the other hand, in that phrase Islamic literary theory, one other thought that arises in my mind is, if there is an Islamic literary theory, should other people then pitch in with a Hindu literary theory, or a Christian literary theory, or maybe even a Buddhist and Jain literary theory, which may or may not prove productive,
Sure.
which may be counterproductive in some ways? The other thing, the other very minor thing that I wish to mention to you about the Islamic part of it, as we understand this in India, Islam has a large presence in India, has had for a very long time. We are the second or the third most populous Muslim nation in the world. We have a long history of harmonious coexistence, punctuated by several episodes of conflict and violence. And we have learned to live with both kinds of developments over a long history of at least 600, 700, 800 years. Khuda and Allah, for example. The question of translatability, the question of juxtaposition of aesthetics and cultures and civilizations. I think until about 30 or 40 years ago, maybe even less, we in India were on the whole not sensitive to the theological distinction between Khuda and Allah. We were not sensitive, perhaps we were not sensitized from stimulus from across the world as to how the two are not really synonyms, that there is the world of a difference between them. Urdu poetry, for example, calls upon Khuda time and again, and Allah very seldom. There is an Urdu couplet which says, Khuda ke dar se hum tumko Khuda to keh nahi sakte. It's a lovely turn of phrase. Because I fear Khuda, therefore you, my love, I cannot call Khuda. Khuda ke dar se hum tumko Khuda to keh nahi sakte, magar shane Khuda, lutfe Khuda, qahir Khuda tum ho. So, I mean, this is one of the Urdu poetic traditions in which blasphemy, apparent blasphemy, is the highest form of faith. Because the beloved is also, in Sufi terms at least, part of the equation with the human being of the God-human relationship. Therefore, this couplet, which seems to be addressed to a human beloved, acquires a divine poignance. But Khuda most of the time. Right. And I do not know how to look back on that long poetic tradition in terms of the decentering of Khuda in favor of Allah, according to recent Islamic trends. One other thing about Urdu that I may wish to mention, you named a number of Islamic languages, right, including Urdu. In India, this statement may need to, in the Indian context, this may need to be seriously qualified. Is Urdu a Muslim language? Has been a burning issue on which so many opinions are available. And I think one needs to take those on board at least and mediate between them. To give a very small bit of statistical data here, there are, I think, about 170 or 180 million Muslims in India. Out of those, 50 million, only 50 million, less than one-third, report that Urdu is their mother tongue. There are Muslims all over South India who use the local South Indian languages and have nothing to do with Urdu. There are any number of people outside Islam who also use Urdu and have traditionally used Urdu and written in Urdu. So both ways. Of course. This needs some qualification, I think, in our context, at least, if not elsewhere. Sure. About these, what I liked best of all, what spoke to me immediately, was your project to decenter the European aesthetics that has ruled the world, from Aristotle onwards, or even before that. Now, you say that Western concepts like creativity and inspiration and influence and their forms of literature, all of these have been assumed by the West at least to be universal, while they're anything but. Now this project, this I think is at the heart of the project that you have undertaken. This is the one that will speak to people all over the world, including to some enlightened souls in the Western world, to say nothing to people beyond that. Now, I'm not going to the translation and symbiotic and synthesis part that you explained. I'll go on to give 2 or 3 examples very briefly. How, in India, our own long literary tradition, beginning with Sanskrit, at least as long back as 1200 BC, how that has been subjected to what I may call the tyranny of Western aesthetics. Partly because Western scholars began the kind of Western scholarship that was in the beginning called Orientalism, and which continued under colonial rule with many Indian imitators of that as well, cultural compradors. To give 2 or 3 examples, many Indians, scholars of Indian literature and also British literature to which, Western literature to which they were exposed, were made to feel quite inadequate and inferior because of the Western formulation that in Sanskrit literature has no tragedy. Tragedy is the highest form arising according to Aristotle, and here we are, benighted souls, we don't even have tragedy. So a number of Indian scholars were put on the defensive in the late 19th century and early 20th century, trying to explain in 20 different ways why we had a good literature even if it did not have tragedy. William Jones, who translated Abhijnan Shakuntalam, said, it's a wonderful play, Kalidasa should be called the Shakespeare of India, high praise, and yet said, I think the 7 acts in that play can easily be collapsed into 5 acts. He only knew the norm of 5 acts. So it was not 5 acts as a defect. No, I think no scholar in the 19th century or early 20th century, even from India, could stand up and point out, look, we are doubly deprived. If we do not have tragedy, we do not have comedy either. We do not believe in that binary. And therefore we are not deprived. You are deprived of a play which does not proceed along these parallel or divergent tracks. Similarly, what is poetry? What is what you call the literary quality of literature, which is, I'm delighted by your very, very broad definition of literary theory, because one is hard put to use the word theory together with literature. But this is fine. Now, in Sanskrit, there's a word kavya, which is used for poetry or for all literary composition, including compositions, long compositions, and prose. Prose is as much part of kavya as verse. This is radical. So this, many Western scholars, even the most erudite, could not wrap their minds around. And this also led to a lot of misrepresentation and a lot of misunderstanding. From Winternitz, who wrote a history of Indian literature in 3 volumes, down to A.K. Warder, who has written a 7-volume history of Kavya, including my very dear friend Sheldon Pollock to some extent. They all go by a certain definition of Kavya, which is not inclusive but highly exclusive, taking it to mean tremendously highly ornamented and artificial poetry, artificial in the sense of full of artifice, while we are as inclusive as possible, as I said, including even prose compositions. Another misconception is regarding the term translation, which is key to your project again. In the university where you studied for your PhD, Columbia, in the year 2004, your friend and mine, David Damrosch, who's also been here as a guest of Clay and has spoken at our conferences, one conference at least, he organized a conference to which he invited me, and the title of the conference was Translatio. I thought it was a misprint, but he actually meant translatio, which is translation
Latin.
in the ancient world. Now, I told them that in India, there was no translation in our ancient world. I told them that there was no translation. I'm good at spectacular negative findings. And I told them that there was no translation in the medieval world either. In what sense? Nothing was being translated into the Indian languages. There was no translation until the British came. The world was translating our works into their languages. The project of translating Buddhist texts into Chinese, one of the most spectacular examples of collective, prolonged translation activity, fully the rival of Bible translations, but ignored because it's not Western, is India and China. Similarly, the Arabs taking things from Sanskrit literature, right from Panchatantra and mathematical treatises and so on, both ways, East and West. Texts are going out. What is coming into India? Nothing. It's not such a great thing. But there are hardly any translations into India. People in India are translating between non-Indian languages. Abdul Rahim Khan Khanna, the popular Hindi poet, I've just edited a book on him in Hindi.
Wow.
Abdul Rahim Khan Khanna did something quite spectacular in Akbar's court. Akbar's grandfather, Babur, had written his who ruled India for 4 years as the first Mughal emperor, wrote his autobiography. And that was in Chagatai Turkish. By the time Akbar is ruling, Persian has replaced Turkish as the language of the Mughal court. So Akbar says to Rahim, who is one of the most astoundingly multilingual people of that age, and a poet besides, Akbar says to Rahim, why don't you translate my grandfather's autobiography into Persian? Which he does. So people are, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata have been translated into Persian, but hardly anything from Persian in India. This needs to be understood. Sanskrit, Ramayana and Mahabharata have been rendered into all the modern Indian languages, but no Indian calls them translation. This widens the very concept of translation. The 4 kinds of literary appropriations that you talked about are therefore fascinating in this context. Finally, you are a professor of comparative literature. You are here as the guest of the Comparative Literature Association of India. But my first loyalty is to the post-colonial. To the post-colonial. And I'm delighted to see that your project is a post-colonial project in comparative clothing.
Interesting. I like that.
This, it seems to me, is the best part of the project. Again, you are trying to decenter Western aesthetics, Western literary theory, and I am particularly fascinated by the fact that you locate the epicenter of your resistance in the Caucasus. Now that is as problematic a word as Islam.
It is, yes. Well, much more. I would say much more.
And you're fully aware of it.
Yes.
So you're riding many tigers. And I really appreciate the daring. Caucasus, as you know better than I do, has been used in a completely, blatantly racist way.
Absolutely.
And still continues to be used
by Europeans, yes.
in the USA,
absolutely.
Where you've been for a long time, where you perhaps
I was born.
I don't know. But you have another foot in Georgia and Dagestan.
Correct.
Which is, I think, a perfect combination to be inside and outside both. So it seems to me that this kind of location, your cultural location, your academic location, this gives you the kind of double vantage point. And also the frame of your project, which I interpret, even if you may not accept it, as being as post-colonial and its theoretical orientation as it is comparative. These arouse a sense of expectancy and excitement in a person like myself, who has only listened to your lecture. I'll get round to reading some of your published work regarding this new project. And I think I'm sure I will be full of anticipation to see what comes out of your grand project, your extremely worthwhile project and exciting project as the next few years pass.
Fabulous.
Delighted to be here and to have listened to your lecture.
Thank you so much. So I can respond, or?
Oh yes. Actually, Harish, as usual, we were expecting this kind of exposure, and you have added delight to the
Thank you.
analysis. And the terms which you have given, post-colonial in comparative clothing, is
love that.
Remarkable, and it could come only through you. I now request our friend from GNU and Syed Akhtar Hussain to kindly give your analysis.
Most respected Kapila ji, Professor Harish Trivedi, Dr. Chandra Mohan, and Dr. Ruth Gould, and indeed a very compact and erudite company of scholars and listeners which we have in India International Center. It was indeed a pleasure listening to your discourse. I would like to begin with a very mild note that there used to be a visiting professor from University of Allama Tabatabai to Delhi University, and he was living in a place here in Delhi. The name of that place is Bengali Market, and he was a tenant there, living in a house of a Hindu gentleman who happened to be India's ambassador to Egypt at one point of time, and his name was Om Prakash. This gentleman, who was his tenant, every time when I visited him, he had a genuine complaint against his landlord, that he had stopped the water supply, he was overcharging me, etc. Like all the tenants in India have against their landlord. But he could not pronounce his name properly, Om Prakash. And the way he was trying to pronounce his name, it was very difficult for him to pronounce. Then he said that, can you translate this name for me into Persian? I said it is very easy. His name can be translated as Ziaul Haq. You have visited Delhi Lodi Garden this morning and you have come across the tombs here. Believe me, these tombs speak a lot. The person who is lying very close to India International Center, Sikandar Lodi, he was the first man who had laid the foundation of Persian studies in India. During his time, way back in 15th century, Persian becomes the administrative language of India. Later on, during the time of Akbar, in 1581, it became the official language of India. So when Persian became the administrative language of India, the Indians started feeling to have they felt the necessity of writing dictionaries and grammars. Because from grammar and dictionary, they could start their enterprise of learning a language which was quite foreign to this country. But with the passage of time, Persian found a second home in India. And the dictionaries which were written in India and the grammar books which were written in India about Persian, those dictionaries were not written even in the mainland Persian.
Correct.
So India has got lots of contribution to the advancement of Persian language and literature and Persian studies, even to the extent of journalism. Persian journalism started from India. Raja Ram Mohan Roy happened to be the first editor of the newspaper, and at that time we were having over a dozen newspapers, Persian newspapers being published from India, Persian newspapers, and Iran did not start Persian newspaper journalism at all. Only after 15 years, after 15 years, in 1837, journalism started in Iran. Now, the period of time which you have selected for your project happens to be 11th century, the time when the Shahnameh, the grand epic, was written. And that was the time when we could see the renaissance of Persian literature.
Yes.
Persian literature was having a rebirth after a lapse of 200 years of Arab rule over Iran. So the first thing which the Persians realized, that they must have their own poetics. That was their necessity. In order to discover themselves in poetics, they started writing books on poetry, and they wanted to theorize it, because first you have literature and then you have literary theory. It is not the other way around. We always put the horse before the cart and not the cart before the horse. So we need to produce a type of literature so as to match with the literary theory. Now, literary theory, as it is understood in the West, and as Professor Harish Trivedi was also saying, that you try to decentralize this literary theory from the Western theory altogether. Unfortunately, we have been following the literary theory of the West in order to understand the literature of the East. That is a mismatch in the sense.
Absolutely.
Whereas we could evolve our own literary theory. Very recently, Kapila ji had questioned that why Central Asia should be called Central Asia. What is centrality of Central Asia? Because this is not the term which we have coined. It was the term which was coined in the West, and they wanted to understand the East with the help of their own coinage, with their own invention, with their own words and with their own lenses and with their own aspect altogether. Now, going back to this discourse, you have given the names of 3 books written by very eminent writers, like the books like Tarjumanul Balagha and Hadiqatul Seher, and then Al-Mujam fi Mahair fi Ash'arul Ajam. Now, these books are again Persian literature, happen to be a literature which is a product of Persian language. But Persian language could not continue, could not afford to have the continuity from the time of Avesta and Pahlavi. Because after Avesta and Pahlavi, we have 200 years of silence, and then from that silence re-emerged the Persian language with which we are engaged nowadays. Written in Arabic character, having Arabic words because of religious necessity and other terminologies which are there. Similarly, the question arose at that time that what could be the poetics of our literature? And they had to look to the Arabs, because the Arabs considered their language to be very eloquent. And because they consider their language to be eloquent and the language of the rest of the world as dumb, because the people outside the Arabian Peninsula, they could not speak Arabic language, hence they were dumb, and they called them Ajam. Ajam means dumb, and Arab means one who can speak, eloquent. So this eloquence of which the Arabs were proud, but they had only one poetic form, which is qasida, that is the ode, and they did not have any other poetic forms. As far as ghazal is concerned, as far as rubai is concerned, as far as other forms of literature is concerned, they did not have those poetic forms in them. But it was the genius of the Persians who detected that there is a ghazal in ode, of which the Arabs were not aware. So they extricated the ghazal aspect from the qasida and gave an independent identity to a poetic form, which has become so popular throughout the ages that today the most popular form of poetic expression happens to be ghazal in our subcontinent.
Right.
And it was but a great contribution of the Persians to Islamic literature. Now, as far as Islamic literature is concerned, this is, I don't know whether you have noted the fact that in this book, Tarjumanul Balagha, which is edited by Dr. Azar, and it was discovered in the library at Istanbul. There, another
Rediscovered.
another Iranian scholar, Dr. Abbas Iqbal Ashtibani, talks about that this book was in oblivion for a very long
Right.
time. And it was attributed to Farrukhi,
Yes.
that it was the work of Farrukhi, but
Mhm.
you found that no, it was not the work of Farrukhi, but it was the work of Raduyani altogether. There, it was thought by the scholars that the book was lost altogether. And then in that context, Dr. Iqbal Abbas Ashtiani says that it is Adabiyat-e Islami Iran.
Interesting.
The wording, he is writing in the year 1956, not today. You are coining the term today, Islamic literature, but he was more concerned about Islamic literature. Now, Islamic literature of which country? That is important than Islamic literature per se. When we talk about Islamic literature, then he talks about Islamic literature of Iran, quite distinct from Islamic literature of Persia. Again, we talk about Islamic literature when we talk about Urdu. Iqbal happened to be a Persian poet and an Urdu poet, and his work in Persian is more than Urdu. Nonetheless, is his poetry an Islamic poetry? Now, $64 question arises here. Now, even today, the people are facing the same problem in Iran today. They have a discourse called Milli Mazhabi and Mazhabi Milli. Am I an Indian first or a Muslim first? This is a big question. In India, I would say that I am an Indian first and a Muslim second. But in Iran, today, nobody can afford to say that I am an Iranian first and Muslim second. There, the condition is such, or for that matter, in any Islamic country, they will have to admit that we are Muslims first and Pakistani second, or we are Muslims first and Iranian second, or in Saudi Arabia they would say we are Muslims first and Saudi second. So the discourse of Islam, religion and nationality, religio-nationality discourse is very much rife in Muslim country, and the people are still grappling with this conundrum till date. Now, in that context, I would like to draw your attention to again a very hilarious type of experience. In Pakistan, the Chief Justice of Pakistan was Bhagwan Das. His name was Bhagwan Das,
yes,
who passed away very recently. Now, when he was being a Pakistani, and by practice he was a Hindu, but he was the Chief Justice or Justice in Pakistan. Now, one of the poets writes a beautiful lines about him and about the Pakistanis. He says that ताज़ीम अदालत की चिंता है बहुत उसको, कानून के चरणों में मुजरिम को बैठा देता, इस कौम के चोरों पे ये वक्त भी आना था, अल्लाह के बंदों को भगवान सजा देगा. What is our problem today is what Dr. Harish Trivedi was saying, that whether we will say Khuda Hafiz or we will say Allah Hafiz, there is a political connotation to it. Kapila ji, Chandra, Mohan, Sahab, Dr. Harish Trivedi, myself, we have been living, our forefathers have been living in a composite culture where when we were parting we would say Khuda Hafiz. But over the last 2 decades altogether, there is a coinage and currency of a phrase called Allah Hafiz. Now this is somewhat, it is fraught with political connotation, where one could see the Saudi brand of Islam is being imposed upon the vast multitude of the Muslim Ummah, what I could say. Now, one of the Pakistani acquaintances of mine, she was chatting with me in WhatsApp, and I said that when we concluded our conversation, I said that Khuda Hafiz. She asked me, who's Khuda? I told her, I took the name of her father and my father. I said that Khuda of Sayyid Mubarak Hussain and Khuda of Ata Karim Bar. That means her father's and my father. I said that they used to say Khuda Hafiz. Then she issued me a fatwa, a dicta of a religious authority, 2 pages in the WhatsApp message, and I found that the Alim has also said that Khuda and Allah is one and the same thing. There is no difference. Now, when we talk about Islamic literature, there are many nuances. We have common heritage, and how we are going to assimilate those things into the corpus of literature is a big challenge. I'll just give you one example and would like to conclude my comment on that. Ghalib, whom Harish Trivedi knows better than me, he writes a beautiful poem that was his last poem, which he could not conclude. The name of that poem is Abre Bohar Bar. That means the pearl raining cloud, the cloud that bursts into pearls altogether. And there he talks about beautiful and very subtle issues of Islam. He talks with God. He tries to show how Prophet Muhammad, he traveled from Jerusalem to the 7th heaven to meet God and everything. All issues of spiritualism, of astronomy, of poetry are couched in that beautiful poem, which is known as Abre Bohar Bar. But there he talks at the same time about his personal life. He says that I don't want to go to paradise because when I come out from the Sharabkhana tavern in Old Delhi with my clothes unbuttoned and my hairs unkempt and in a state of intoxication, at dead of the night I come out with humming poems and just tottering myself and couldn't stand properly and walking the alleys of the shanty town where a very religious woman, my wife, is waiting for a drunkard husband at home. I won't get that pleasure and that leisure in paradise. I don't want to go to paradise.
It's beautiful.
And then he says that God, you want to ask the account of taking wine every day, how many cups of wine I consume every night. Why don't you ask those kings like Jamshid and Hoshan and Parvez who created wine and who drank wine in their palatial houses and enjoyed the company of houris, and I am just taking wine in order to forget the worries of the world, and that too I take wine 1 or 2 cups. And that too, I don't have money, I take it on credit. Sometimes I borrow money from others and I drink that wine. If you want to hold anybody accountable, hold Jamshid, the person who had invented the wine. But why you are asking me whether I take wine or not? So is this not an Islamic literature? It is Islamic literature.
I think so.
When Iqbal talks about Himalaya, that is also Islamic literature. It is not Islamic literature must have a genesis in the Quran or in the tradition. It takes, Islam is a type of stream that flows into different climes and different places, and it assumes its own color. That is, in fact, constitute Islamic theory and Islamic culture and Islamic. I wish you could have dealt with Chahar Maqale.
Oh, absolutely. It's part of the project. Yes,
that
I am.
could have given you more better theory than the text, because these texts deal with mostly the figure of speech. What could be tashbih, what could be a simile, what could be metaphor, what could be pun, what could be alliteration, what could be allusions, what could be references, etc., etc. But when we look to a Persian theory, that what is poetry? That answer, he says, that there are many poets whose poetry die down in their own lifetime. That is not poetry. Poetry is something that should live after the life of the poet. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Uncle sir, अब ऊपर चलते हैं. गालिब के पास.
Akhtar Saab, this was brilliant.
Yes.
The supplementary additions made by you to the main discourse is excellent. And I must, we are lucky that the whole thing has come out as a wonderful discourse. हमने सुना था संवाद होते हैं, लेकिन आज का ये जो प्रोग्राम है, it has really came out a real dialogue or samvad. Not only one, we have 3 discourses now, and added to, all have added the beauty of the subject in understanding it and in appreciating it. We have 5 minutes more, and I can invite questions or any query from the audience. They have come all the way. Please do it.
There is no use being repetitive on what Dr. Harish Trivedi has already shed light. I had the same doubts, questions about her topic, the Islamic theories, etc. So most of the questions he raised, and in the very raising of the question, he has answered also. So I don't think I should repeat them. But still, there are certain doubts about your title, Islamic. There is no Christian reconstruction. Construction is universal. There is no Hindu Bakrokti. There is no what's called North Indian sport. Sport, Bakrokti, deconstruction, these are the theories which universally apply to any literature. So I wanted something like that, and which I request you to have a project on Indian literary theory. Dr. Harish Trivedi can help you a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Any other scholar commenting anything? Yes, sir. Your good name, sir?
My name is Karni Singh.
Okay.
So my question is to Syed Akhtar Hussain Saab, who remarked correctly so about this dichotomy between being a Pakistani second and Muslim first, or that same dichotomy is everywhere where you're a Muslim first but why is this everywhere else? It's understandable, but why the Persians or Iranians should take it like that? Because they have got a history which goes far beyond their being Muslims, and it's a proud history. So many other countries don't have that sort of history. So why are Persians caught up in that of being Muslims first and Persians later?
There are 2 positions, in fact, on that. One is, if you talk to any Persian, and when he talks in an informal manner, he would say that he is Persian first and a Muslim second. But in a given political scenario, it's very difficult because everything comes through the channel of Islam there. If there is a seminar on architecture, Molvi will come and he will say that yes, there is a theory of architecture in the Quran, and then he starts speaking hours together on the architectural implications from the verses of the Quran. If there is a medical science conference and it's a cancer conference, then he will again, the Molvi will come and talks about the medical theory of cancer in the Quran, and he will go on. Just like in our country nowadays, we are having a blue claims that during Vedic period we had everything, etc., etc. So in a political scenario today, But it changes. It is not that it is constantly the same. Because when there was a nationalization of oil, at that time when Mossadegh was leading a movement, and it was the regime of the Shah, it was not that they were Muslims first, they were Iranians first and Muslims second, but they were very good Muslims at that point of time. But today, because everything is Islamicized and Islam is politicized or politics is Islamicized, it's so difficult to say in Iran. So in such conditions, you know, wherever you are, human being will have the same fate and he's subject to the same sort of unfortunate conditions altogether. Thank you.
अख्तर साहब आपसे एक सवाल है, आप इस तरह सोचते हैं, इस तरह बोलते हैं, तो अब तक आपके खिलाफ सिर्फ एक ही फतवा
I again answer to that. One of our common friends, Dr. Carpenter, he was just when Kapila ji was hosting the conference on Central Asia and India, then he asked me that why don't you organize something on contemporary Persia also. I said that is an area I don't want to venture into because I will be inviting lots of fatwas again.